Oliver Cann, I'm Head of Strategic Communications here at the Forum. I'm very delighted to kick off our first series of issue briefings at the annual meeting 2019 with, I think, one of the more important subjects that we're going to be discussing this week. It's about the state of public opinion. And in this short and very brief half-hour session, we're going to try to cover an awful lot of ground. But essentially what we're going to be addressing is the role of civil society and how it is responsible for representing the interests of the public to our leaders, but also examining and discussing how their means of influencing policy is changing and what role technology is having in that. Now, I've got a couple of key documents that I want to kind of introduce into the session, not at length because we haven't got a lot of time. The first is an opinion poll that we conducted, very, very short notice, about a week before the meeting. Globalisation 4.0. You're all familiar with the theme of this meeting. But we wanted to know what the people around the world thought. People in every region, of every age, of every socioeconomic strata, men and women. They wanted to know what they thought about the issues that we think and keep ourselves up awake at night on. Fascinating, and we put out a lot of media around this. We were quite surprised, very pleasantly, to know that rather than the current narrative of cooperation between nations being seen as a zero-sum game, a supermajority of global opinion prefer to cooperate, and they think international collaboration is the way ahead. They also think that migration is more good than bad. They believe in climate science. There's a few notable differences there, and but it's a fascinating report. I would urge you to read it if you have any time. I want to use it as the basis of a discussion here, but we also will be producing another paper tomorrow, Civil Society in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, where we look at the evolving role of the civil society sector, how it's changing and what it needs to do to thrive. So that's enough from me. As I mentioned before, I want to keep this session as fast-flowing as possible, so I encourage as much interjection, as many questions as you like. Don't feel free to stand on any ceremony to stick your hand up. I like a bit of disagreement, if you can help me out there. Diversity of opinion is what it's all about. So I'm very keen, very glad to be joined by Kumi, Naidoo, Secretary General, Amnesty International, based in the United Kingdom. You're also a young global leader. I believe you're an alumni. You're still young, but you're not that young anymore. Lauren Woodman, you're the Chief Executive of NetHope in the USA, another very well-known civil society organization doing a lot of great work helping use technology for good reasons and delivering aid and improving societies. So let's just kick off with this one question. Global technology is seen as doing much more good than harm, although 35 to 45% of respondents in every region are ambivalent. It's actually quite close, this one. I was quite surprised by this. So if we're looking at various regions of the world, North America, Western Europe, the actual regional average is that people believe technology no longer is doing more good than harm. They believe technology is doing more bad than harm. So I'd like to know your opinion on this one. Let's start with you, Kumi. I suspect, Lauren, you're given by the name NetHope. I'm expecting a rosier outlook, but Kumi, let's start with you. You're more of a mystery enigma on this one.
Okay, no, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So, civil society actually has used technology most powerfully to connect across national boundaries and so on. So, if you look at transnational civil society movements, which involve people from multiple countries, we would not have been able to do it actually without the technological tools that became available. Having said that, we are now concerned about what artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, all of these things brings to technology and what impact it's going to have. So, for example, my last call that I did before we wrapped up for Christmas was with Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, because we brought out a report as Amnesty International called Toxic Twitter, which had about 10,000 young people across the world who help us analyze voluntarily the data, which showed high levels of abuse against women, and particularly women of color. So that telephone call was to put pressure to get, Twitter to make the right investments. Obviously, Twitter doesn't want abuse on the platform, but it's not good enough saying we oppose it. It's your platform, you have to do that. Now, I'm just using Twitter as an example, but there's a range of different things. I would just conclude by saying that personally, one of my concerns about technology is that when I was at Greenpeace, I used to be the former head of Greenpeace, Al Jazeera called me up and said, we need to come and see you, we've got a hot bunch of documents. So they come to see me, and in it they say, we have got the South African spy cables, and we find here that South Korean intelligence agency, our South African intelligence agency, for information about me when I was going for a G20 meeting because they considered me a dangerous individual, and asked South African intelligence to give them a specific security assessment of myself. So what I'm saying is that for us right now, we are also taking lots of repression, and part of that repression, being able to follow us, monitor us, track us, and so on, has been, sadly, the use of technology by intelligence agencies.
And that's a long time ago. I'd imagine since you left Greenpeace and took up residence at Amnesty International, the means for tracking and surveillance have only increased. And I compare that to what you just said about having to rely on volunteers to do your research on Twitter. And that strikes me that there's a huge imbalance in terms of resources, and the digital space, the digital universe being so huge, with technology moving so fast. What kind of hope have you got of, and I say this as an admirer of Amnesty for being the first international organisation or NGO, I believe, to open up a kind of dedicated Silicon Valley outpost. But what really are your chances of carving out a space to be effective in this emerging world?
No, Oliver, you're absolutely right. You need to have sort of highly competent people who understand the technology, who are tracking the technology, and so on. So the person who headed up our Silicon Valley initiative used to be one of President Obama's key technology people. So we do have, in the leadership of this work, we do have, and I would say that's indispensable. I should tell you, I mean, people of my generation, I discovered recently, are known as digital immigrants, and the millennials are digital natives. So, I certainly need that capacity. However, one of the problems about how we think, about how we address the challenges that we face, we think that it's going to mainly be people who are in full-time jobs, even in NGOs, that are going to make the difference. Absolutely not the reality. We need to create opportunities for many decent people who want to contribute positively to society. So the 2 technology projects that we mobilized thousands of people to participate in. One was reviewing the Twitter stuff. The other, importantly, was tracking what the US-led coalition did in Raqqa, Syria, when they bombed the city to the ground, when they were pushing out ISIS. And so we had a range of, about 6,000 young people who, on GPS, were able to go and track every building that was bombed and so on. So I would conclude my assessment that technology definitely can play a positive role, but built into it, there are many dangers, and we need to talk about the dangers and try and look at how we regulate it. We should not wipe out all of technology as a bad thing, because there are some bad things that happen.
If I could just follow one final question, Kumi. How has the 4th Industrial Revolution, as we like to call it here, affected the core business of Amnesty International?
So quite fundamentally, in the sense that, right now, you have to look at, so when I interviewed for my position in December last year, I was asked the question, if there was one new thing that you would bring to Amnesty and focus on, what would it be? And then I said, focusing on emerging human rights threats, right? Where I included the technology, I acknowledge, even with artificial intelligence, obviously there are good things about artificial intelligence and there are challenges, right? So the one thing is we've embraced it, and have embraced it for some time, but I would say that right now our fear, and maybe if I can just pick the conversation up to a level. So Amnesty is a human rights organization, so you might be surprised to know that one of our key goals right now, our focuses, is addressing the impact of climate change. And why? Very simply, if the head of the global trade union movement says there are no jobs on a dead planet, there are no human beings on a dead planet, there are no human rights on a dead planet. So we have to address that. And one of my deep reservations about the World Economic Forum and the conversations that happened here at Davos is, to a large extent, right since for a long time, but if you take 2008 after the financial crisis, our response was system recovery, system maintenance, system protection. Whereas what we needed to have learned from that moment is that the current system is not working, and what we need is system redesign, system innovation, and system transformation. And that, I would say, is the big challenge for civil society, because we have a choice. We can play by the rules of government and business, and all we then end up doing is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while humanity sinks, or we have the courage as civil society to say, listen, the system is broken fundamentally. The levels of inequality cannot be fixed with the current system. The scientists have told us we have 12 years to get emissions to peak and come down. And when we say all of that, the responsibility of civil society, whether there's technology or no technology, we must have the courage to say things are not working and we need fundamental systemic change, not just incremental steps in a positive direction, which is what I see largely happening in a place like the World Economic Forum.
And fascinating, and hopefully...
You asked me to be controversial, right?
And I like it, and not wishing to work for any role that involves shuffling deck chairs around. I'm personally pleased that the theme of this meeting acknowledges the fact that any future round of global integration needs to take cognizance of the fact that climate change, income inequality, technology, geopolitical shifts are fundamentally changing. It's not about system protection anymore. But I'd love to canvass views here and see what priorities are. But first, Lauren, I'm presuming you're one of the 41% of North Americans that believe technology is somewhat good or mostly good. But please correct me if I'm wrong. But more importantly, after that, I'd love to hear your view as an organization that has grown up around technology, digital native organization. What are the best aspects of the fourth industrial revolution, and what are the worst?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it is fair to say that, on the whole, both myself personally and sort of the outlook of the organization is that technology has a tremendous potential for good. I think also having grown up in the technology sector and doing the work that I do on a day-to-day basis with our member organizations, and that's 57 of the largest humanitarian development and conservation organizations around the world, we recognize that at the end of the day, technology is a tool. And technology as a tool, something that is ones and zeros and silicon chips, is neither inherently good or bad. It is the application of that technology and the way that humans, who do have good or bad or well-scoped or perhaps poorly scoped intentions, actually see the fulfillment of that. And that is where we run into the questions of, is technology good or bad? The Twitter platform within and of itself is neither inherently good or bad. What people do on the Twitter platform, may and does raise some concerns. And so I think when we look at, moving forward, how do we shape the use of technology, which has tremendous potential in humanitarian and development and conservation in those spaces? Our ability to gain greater insights, to know what works, to empower communities, to identify challenges is unleashed, infinitesimally by the application of technology when it's done well. And so that really comes back to the question of how are we deploying technology? How are we empowering organizations and civil society to use technology? Are we asking the right questions? And are we making the investments that we need to make in order for civil society, the private sector, and national governments to work together in order to identify what those risks are and mitigate them?
And we talk about working with partnerships in the private sector, and my colleagues in the civil society team here at the forum talk a lot about the shrinking space of civil society. What is the operating landscape like for an organization like Netflix? You have partnerships with folks such as Microsoft, with Oracle. Tell me, give us some glimpses into how these public-private partnerships really work.
Well, and they work in a lot of different ways, and I think they work in a lot of different ways, reflecting both the nonprofit organizations with which we're working and well as the corporate entities with which we're working, because everyone has different areas of interest, different areas of expertise. I think the big shift that I have seen over the last 25 years in doing this work and the way that partnerships are happening is a real recognition that there's expertise coming out of civil society that that provides insight around the use of technology that technology companies themselves don't necessarily have, and frankly, vice versa. You know, there's knowledge in the technology sector that we in the nonprofit sector are never going to have. I mean, you know, not every organization can pull together the expertise that they need in order to figure out where technology is going to be adequately applied and ethically applied. And so how do we share those resources across the sectors in a way that is both transparent and allows organizations on both sides to benefit from the shared knowledge on either side? And that's super hard to do. It's also facilitated by technology. And certainly I think as we see the changes of the fourth industrial revolution playing out, the role for civil society, and I could not agree with you more, to be an advocate for communities and segments of the population that may potentially be marginalized, or to mitigate the potential negative effects of the changes that we will see, is going to be critical. And making sure that civil society, you know, is part of that conversation, and that we are learning from civil society, will be critical for us to weather the changes that are coming.
And just as Kumi mentions that he's refocusing the priorities of Amnesty in this digital age and to align with very present priorities such as climate change. How is Netflix moving forwards into the future?
Well, I think one of the things that we are looking at, to go back to this question around, you know, how do...
You said Netflix or NetHope?
NetHope, I'm so sorry.
It's okay, it's okay.
No, I was thinking, okay, what has Netflix got to do with this stuff?
I got lots of ideas around what Netflix could do.
Me too.
You know, and if they want to call me, no, we can talk about that. But to your point, I think it is a question of this: how do we help make sure that the human applications are not skewing the technological promise? And so we've actually looked at what is the right skill set that we need in the nonprofit sector in order to understand how to apply technology most effectively, whether we're trying to address questions of health or human rights or conservation. And so do we have that skill set in the sector? And those aren't always technical skills. Those are often very different. And in the private sector, you know, I think a lot of private sector companies have had the incentives to have their workforces understand how to use technology in the pursuit of whatever their respective market aims are. But the challenges that we face in the nonprofit sector around the ethical use of data, around the protection of data, whether or not the security that we have in place for the data that we collect and that we use, all of those questions are really challenging ones that really have to have a human component to them. And that's been a big shift for us over the last 12 to 18 months, and really doubling down there to make sure that organizations that are at the front line are well equipped to use the tools that are available to them.
So a quick show of hands, see who would like to ask a question. Okay, with the lady at the second row. Can we get a microphone, please? If you just wait for the microphone. And the gentleman after this will go to the gentleman in the front row. Can you remind us of your name and where you're from, please?
I prefer to remain anonymous because my question could be controversial. Just going back to the conversation of Twitter or similar platforms, what I find interesting is that these platforms are using artificial intelligence. And I might agree in a certain context that, yes, it is artificial intelligence, it's smart technology, but they are not smart in a cultural context. For example, if you want to report a defamation campaign and you are from the Middle East, the way the artificial intelligence is judging whether it's a defamation or not is based on a Google translation, and it's based on the American law and context. So a lot of people in the Middle East are subject to massive cyberbullying because of the language difference and the way the language is used and the context. So I believe that we don't need smarter technologies at this point. We need a smarter cultural technologies. And if these corporations want to expand internationally, they need to be culturally sensitive when using technologies and AI.
Is that kind of top-down, imposition of cultural norms something that NetHope has to deal with?
Well, I think it's something that every organization struggles with. Frankly, whether you're part of the nonprofit world and civil society or if you're part of the corporate side. I mean, I think one of the challenges that we see with AI, and I am by no stretch of the imagination, an AI expert, but AI works on the quality of data that's coming in and the quality of the algorithms that address that data to generate outputs. And so I think there is a very high level awareness of that challenge. And one of the big questions that the technology sector is dealing with is, how do we make sure that we have quality information that is coming in, that we are identifying bias in algorithms and figuring out how we remove that bias or mitigate that bias as much as possible. That goes back to core questions around data collection and the quality of data collection and bias in data collection. And then how do organizations that are potentially using that data or using that outcome, whether it's for their own internal purposes, just in terms of running the business, whatever business they may be in, or looking at it in order to influence public opinion or to achieve societal goals, that they understand what the limitations of that entire chain might be. That, of course, is a question of skills on the people that, at every point along that way, are we asking the right questions? Do we understand what needs to happen? And those are difficult topics that I think we're all going to have to deal with.
No, I support what you said, but I think your proposition is correct. I mean, that we have to have sensitivity to not only cultural specificity, but also, I would say, to contextual differences, right? Because we see, certain big companies when they move in certain space. I mean, one of the problems we have in Africa right now is that it's become a disease. When there's repression, what our governments do? They just shut down WhatsApp, email, everything. This was in Zimbabwe just the other day. It's been used in Cameroon, in Chad, and so on. But I think, this is something. And on the cyberbullying thing, the only advice I can give to you, I understand that the First Lady of the United States is a big advocate on cyberbullying. Maybe you should ask her to come and give some advice in the Middle East. Maybe it should be helpful. I'm not sure.
Fascinating area, and whether we need better regulation of algorithms is something I was talking with a colleague at length with recently. But we haven't got time for me and my conversations with colleagues. We've got 2 more questions here, and then if we could spend 5 minutes talking about the theme of the meeting. I'm really curious to know your views on globalization 4.0. It's very much an aspirational, moving target. But first of all, gentlemen here in the front row, could we have a microphone, please? And we'll squeeze in after that. To the lady, the gentleman in the 3rd row.
Hi, I'm Nishat from Global Shapers Doha Hub. I work at climate change advocacy in the MENA region. We also use technology as minimals, but they are not translated into policies. We have a different sort of governments working in the Gulf or in the MENA region. How do we actually use this technology? We have massive use of Twitters and Facebook and Instagrams. Our messages are reaching the public, but doesn't reach the governments. So what we advise I can get from civil society head and a technology head, how we minimals use that as a proportion to just get the governments literally here and what policy change we want, especially in case of climate change. The topic is not even on the top priority, even though we see it's the largest and most risk everybody is going to face. People are struggling there with women's rights, war in Yemen and Syria, and some of the countries are still recovering, like Iraq or Libya. So I just want to hear on that process.
It's how to get governments to listen. And if I could throw in on top of that, are governments getting better or worse at listening? If we could have short answers, please, so we can...
Do you want to collect all the answers?
No, we'll do this one, and we'll move on.
Are governments getting better or worse in their use of technology? I don't know that I know the answer to that, right? Because technology...
No, in terms of their listening.
Yeah, I do think they're listening.
Getting governments to listen.
I do think they're listening. I think they are challenged like so many people are, in that technology moves so quickly that it is hard for them to keep up. And in a world of limited resources, which every government faces limited resources, where to invest is a huge challenge. And I think that's one of the key questions that we're going to have to address in the question of globalization 4.0. How do we learn from one another, do so dynamically, and make sure that policymakers are listening and understand what they're hearing?
That's a very charitable view. Kumi, do you share it?
I think there's a gradation here.
Fair enough.
So I have a brutal analysis on how do we deal with making ourselves be heard. Our starting point has to be that our political and business leaders, with exceptions of course, all suffer from the same medical condition. They all have a real problem with hearing. And if we're going to get our messages through to them, right, history has taught us that especially if we are talking about the survival of humanity as a species, climate change, if we are talking about addressing inequality, which is also a question of survival, then I would say that if history teaches us anything, when there needed to be a big shift in power and a systemic change, those that are beneficiaries of that system, right, are not going to be the ones who are going to lead the change. So it's not the people at Davos who are going to lead the change. Let's be clear about it, right?
Try.
No. I mean, try. What I'm saying is that the constituent participants in the conversation here are far too vested in the system. And I'm talking especially on the business side as well as on the government side. And let me just say, for us in civil society, don't make a mistake to think that we are like pure and not contaminated by the system. I can tell you in my job, I have to make completely brutal sort of decisions like a CEO would. So in that context, what does history teaches us? That when humanity faced a major injustice with their slavery, colonialism, a woman's right to vote, apartheid, civil rights in the US and so on, those struggles only move forward when decent men and women stood up and said, enough is enough and no more. We're prepared to go to prison if necessary. We're prepared to go put our lives on the line if necessary. So let me just say right now, what we're seeing around the world is that kind of thing happening. But the danger is that it's not infused with sufficient levels of organization, and that always allows the kind of tough man personalities like Trump and Bolsonaro and others to come and manipulate legitimate angers that people or concerns that people might have and direct them in a direction of racism, misogyny, fascism, and xenophobia.
So let's move swiftly on. Very good answer, Kumi. To the lady in the front row.
I'm Rola Khala from the Financial Times. I just want to ask about the main point that you made, that it's not tech, it's the application of tech. If we think of something like deepfakes, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the technology is advancing at a rate that allows for abuse, precisely because there's no one on the other side to either control or regulate. There is no transparency in the way that these technologies are being developed. And so how do you mitigate against that? Because this is a case where the tech itself is a problem.
Well, I mean, if you look at the question of deepfakes is a very hard one, and it's going to get harder and harder, right, as the technology gets better and better. But again, I would say, the fact that we can do things with technology, can also be, there's also a very positive side that we could potentially use the very same abilities to, do image manipulation and whatnot. Those things could be quite positive and in a different context. I don't know the answer to this question of, how do we regulate the use of technologies to ensure, and the development of technologies to ensure that it is being developed in the right direction with the application where it needs to be. I don't know, and I don't have a lot of faith, frankly, that governments are well positioned to do a regulatory approach. I mean, a patchwork of regulations that are inherently going to lag behind what is possible means that we will always be playing catch up. There needs to be a much more constructive conversation around what the ethical use of technology looks like and how we hold organizations, whether they be in the private sector, in the civil society, or in the public sector, accountable for the use of that technology. That conversation simply has to happen. But I think that again, part of the challenge that we have is do we have enough people who understand the potential for the application of technology, what to look for, the types of questions to ask, and then how to come up with better solutions engaged in the conversation or not? And I would posit that the answer is no.
I'd love to dwell on that. It's a fascinating subject, but we've got 1 minute, I'm told. So, gentlemen in the third row, please, could you ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I am Manuel Pulgar Vidal with WWF International. So what it is happening in France with the yellow vest, it is lack of just transition. And it is just related to one specific measure, carbon taxes with lack of social consideration. So that is happening in France, and hope that they can sort it soon. Let's imagine that we are moving towards globalization 4.0 or 4th industrial revolution. So my point and my question it is, what kind of just transition measures we should adopt as a way to don't leave anyone behind because of artificial intelligence, technology, genomics, among some others, because that is key. There is a point, there are people saying that probably workers could be irrelevant in the future. So how can we manage that transition toward this globalization 4.0?
In 30 seconds each, please.
With extreme difficulty, Manuel. With extreme difficulty. But I think that we have an obligation, firstly, to say that the men and women who work in the fossil fuel, dirty energy sector are not our enemies. They are our brothers and sisters. They are providing something that society told them that's the only way. And it is imperative on us to ensure that the transition to clean energy does not punish people who in good faith. So therefore, the proposition has been with the unions to say that with younger workers, we should be making investments in them to transition to clean energy technologies. And by the way, I've looked at this when I was at Greenpeace. There are some similarities in technologies anyway. You know, some of the things, it's not like a rocket science to support people. If there's political will to ensure that people can transition, it can happen. With older workers, obviously, we want to ensure that they are compensated properly and so on. Now, in the current world that we live in, what I'm saying is not radical. If you go back and look at 20 years, 30 years ago, we treated people humanely. So I think the problem, though, overall problem, is robotics, not just with energy, and how that is sort of pushing the agenda that we don't need people in labor and so on. So that I don't have a solution. I don't know. I mean, we have to be alive to it, and we have to bring some rationality to it. I think it's going to be very difficult where we are right now to push back on some of that mechanization in its entirety, but I think it can be managed and made a little more saner and thoughtful and compassionate and economically useful as well in the way we move forward.
Things are just warming up. So, Lauren, before we get kicked out of this room, is controlling robotics and the wave of automation disruption the right way, the best way to transition to globalization 4.0?
Well, I think it speaks to a broader question, which is how do we reskill workers to address the transitions that are coming? And that's going to happen because of AI, robotics, and any other number of technologies. That, I think, is going to end up being the critical question if we're going to be successful with this transition. Oh, God, I have to do this. So today we published a report, Rescaling Revolution, where we actually create some of the pathways to actually managing this transition. So some of the findings were quite scary. We found out the private sector would only transition 25% of all at-risk workers. So there was a big burden on the state. But we also found that's an investment. And for 70% of workers, reskilling would create higher revenue through taxes and reduce welfare benefits. It would be a profitable exercise. That's on our website. Go to the media section of the website. It's a fascinating report. Now, before we get kicked out, so 48% globally believed that technology does more good than harm. 52% believed it did more harm than good. When we come back this time next year, and we have, hopefully we discuss this and we do this poll again, who in the room thinks that we're going to see more people believing that technology is doing more harm than good in the world? Quick show of hands. That's a minority. That's a minority. So we 50-50. Well, we're an optimistic bunch, so I'm accounting for the forum bias here towards positive outcomes. So I'm taking that to mean that you're all techno-optimists. And with that, all it really leaves for me to say is thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for joining us here in the room, and also thank you for watching us live online. Thank you.
Thank you.